The Senate chamber is rarely a place of surprise. It is built on routine, on speeches rehearsed to exhaustion, on arguments calculated to the decimal point. Yet on this day, the air itself seemed to shift. A silence so heavy descended that even the scrape of a chair against marble felt like thunder. And at the center of it all stood Elizabeth Warren, her voice steady, deliberate, and utterly disarming. She looked across the room, eyes narrowing slightly, not with malice but with conviction. And then, in a tone equal parts admiration and defiance, she said it. What Representative Jasmine Crockett has shown here today is brilliance. Brilliance that this body would do well to recognize. Gasps, audible, unguarded gasps. The words hit like a shockwave. Senators who prided themselves on masks of composure found their brows raised, lips pursed, heads turning in disbelief. Staffers leaned forward, stunned at what they had just heard. Reporters' pens froze mid-sentence, as though even ink needed a moment to catch up. For a second, one suspended, fragile heartbeat, it felt as though the entire chamber forgot how to breathe. Compliments of this magnitude were not handed out like candy, not from Warren, whose reputation was forged on scrutiny and sharpness. Her acknowledgement was not casual. It was surgical, a blade cutting through the noise, granting legitimacy in a place where too many tried to deny it. The power of those words was not only in their rarity, but in their target. Jasmine Crockett, a rising figure, a woman whose presence had already unsettled the status quo, had just been validated by one of the most formidable senators in America. And validation, in that room, was more explosive than any insult, more destabilizing than any attack. Across the aisle, faces tightened. Some shifted uncomfortably, others feigned indifference, but no one could disguise the impact. For every critic who had dismissed Crockett, this was a rebuke wrapped in praise. For every ally who had quietly admired her, it was a rallying cry, finally spoken aloud. The chamber would never forget that moment. But to understand why Warren's words left the chamber speechless, we have to rewind. To truly grasp the weight of Warren's words, you have to see the battlefield they were spoken upon. This was no ordinary session. The chamber had been charged for days, a storm of debates crackling with bitterness, with tempers running hotter than the August sun. The topics at hand weren't just policies on paper, they were identity, justice, and the future direction of a nation fractured between progress and resistance. Every exchange felt like a battle scar waiting to happen. And in that climate, Jasmine Crockett had become a lightning rod. Fresh in her rise, bold in her tone, she wasn't supposed to stand tall in these halls of marble. Rivals made it clear. They intended to test her, to press her until she cracked, to prove that her voice was too sharp, too unapologetic, too unafraid of naming truths. Others wanted buried. Every question hurled at her came laced with dismissal. Every sideways glance intended to remind her she was new, that she had not yet earned her stripes. Yet Crockett refused to bow. Session after session, she met attacks with precision, her words cutting through obfuscation, her composure steady in the face of condescension. That resilience didn't sit well with her critics. If anything, it infuriated them more. The idea that a black woman from Texas could stride into the nation's most powerful spaces and refuse to play the role assigned to her, that was a direct affront to the hierarchies carefully maintained for decades. This was the tinderbox into which Elizabeth Warren dropped her spark. A single sentence of praise, yes, but one that carried the weight of a cannon blast. Because in politics, words are currency. They build legacies, they destroy careers, they ignite movements. Warren's acknowledgement wasn't just a compliment. It was an endorsement, a validation that Crockett's brilliance was not only real, but impossible to ignore. And that endorsement came with consequences. Allies knew it instantly. You could see it in the way their eyes lit up, how they leaned into their seats as though catching their second wind. But detractors, their discomfort was unmistakable. This wasn't the script they had prepared for. Warren's voice, seasoned and respected, had just dismantled months of careful undermining. It disrupted the quiet consensus that Crockett was to be tolerated, but never celebrated. That is what made the moment dangerous. Because hierarchies don't collapse from shouts. They collapse from undeniable truths spoken aloud. Warren had given Crockett more than recognition. She had shattered the illusion that brilliance could be ignored if it came from the wrong person, the wrong background, the wrong story. It was no longer a matter of one representative holding her own in debate. It was a story about legitimacy, about whose voices were allowed to shape the narrative of America's future. And the more that truth echoed in that chamber, the more fragile the old order began to look. What followed would prove that this was no fleeting moment. This was a turning point, one that rattled the pillars of power in ways no one had anticipated. And the reason this moment was so dangerous, it challenged the very power structure that has always tried to silence voices like Crockett's. Every great drama needs its villains, and in Jasmine Crockett's story, they were never subtle. From the moment she entered the halls of power, detractors circled like hawks, eager to dismiss her presence as a novelty, eager to whittle her down to a caricature they could mock on cable news or in whispered jokes behind closed doors. To them, Crockett wasn't a rising leader. She was a target, an interloper threatening the comfort of their old order. Some of the sharpest barbs came from rival senators who wore their arrogance like armor. They rolled their eyes at her pointed questions during hearings, smirked as if her words were interruptions rather than contributions. One, in a moment caught on camera, leaned back with arms folded and muttered to a colleague, "She'll learn her place soon enough." That single sentence embodied the condescension Crockett faced daily, the presumption that her brilliance was a phase, a flicker that would fade when confronted with the weight of real politics. And it wasn't just senators. Pundits, those self-anointed arbiters of seriousness, seized the opportunity to belittle her. On evening panels, they dismissed her arguments as performative. They framed her fiery defense of justice as grandstanding. They cast her confidence as arrogance, her wit as disrespect. Yet when the same traits appeared in her male counterparts, they were called commanding or strategic. It was the oldest double standard in politics, recycled and repackaged, wielded like a weapon against anyone who dared to challenge the norm. The attacks weren't always loud. Sometimes they came in subtler forms, invitations that never arrived, meetings where her name was conspicuously absent, op-eds that erased her contributions while elevating others. Power can be cruel in its quiet exclusions, and Crockett felt the sting of those absences as clearly as any insult hurled across the chamber. But arrogance is rarely content to remain in the shadows. It must display itself, prove its dominance. That's why her detractors escalated their dismissals into open hostility. They labeled her too aggressive, a coded phrase meant to police both gender and race. They scoffed at her legal expertise, despite her years of service as a public defender. They questioned her motives, painting her as a figure chasing attention rather than substance. Every attack followed the same script: strip away her legitimacy, reduce her voice to noise, and remind the public that she did not belong in the arena of giants. Yet the irony was thick, because in their arrogance, they revealed their fear. Each attempt to silence her betrayed an unease, an unspoken recognition that Crockett's presence was destabilizing. Her sharpness exposed their complacency. Her clarity made their evasions obvious. Her very existence threatened the narrative that power belonged only to those who looked and spoke a certain way. And so they kept at it. Critics in the chamber, pundits on television, anonymous voices in editorials, all united by a desire to diminish what they could not control. To them, Crockett's rise was an inconvenience. To the public watching, it was becoming something else entirely. Because arrogance has a way of overplaying its hand, and every sneer, every dismissive remark, every attempt to corner her only added to the contrast. Their pettiness against her composure, their disdain against her unshakable focus. The more they tried to paint her as unworthy, the clearer her worth became. The louder their dismissals grew, the more resonant her voice sounded to those desperate for authenticity in politics. These were the forces arrayed against her when Elizabeth Warren spoke her words of praise. A coalition of doubt, arrogance, and fear, all suddenly confronted with a truth they couldn't laugh away. But while her opponents sharpened their attacks, few knew that Crockett's journey had already forged her into something far stronger. Before Jasmine Crockett ever stepped into the glare of the Senate's lights, her story had already been written in grit, resilience, and fire. She was not handed a podium, nor was her voice cultivated in the echo chambers of privilege. It was sharpened in the classrooms where she was underestimated, in the neighborhoods where justice felt like an afterthought, and in the courtrooms where she fought for clients no one else would defend. Crockett's rise began far from the marble of Washington. Growing up, she saw firsthand how systems could either ignore or crush the very people they were meant to serve. That awareness became her compass. She studied law not as a ticket to prestige, but as a weapon for the voiceless. As a public defender, she carried the weight of countless lives on her shoulders, clients facing sentences that would shatter families, men and women criminalized, not because they were dangerous, but because they were poor, because they were black, because they were easy targets. In those courtrooms, she learned the art of precision. Every argument had to be razor sharp. Every pause, every word carried the possibility of saving someone's future. And in those battles, Crockett developed not just legal skill, but a resilience that no dismissive remark in Congress could shake. She knew what it meant to stand alone, to argue against stacked odds, and to hold her ground, even when the system seemed engineered for her defeat. That resilience carried into politics. When she decided to run for office, the skeptics lined up. Quickly. They said she was too bold, too unfiltered, too unwilling to play the quiet game of patience. But Crockett understood something her critics did not. People were tired of patience. They were tired of waiting for dignity, tired of excuses from leaders who promised change while protecting the status quo. Her bluntness wasn't a flaw. It was a lifeline for communities desperate to be heard. In hearing rooms across the country, Crockett's voice became unmistakable. She questioned with force, but also with wit, cutting through evasions with the kind of clarity that left witnesses fumbling. When opponents tried to box her in, she didn't just defend herself, she turned their attacks back on them with a smile, exposing the weakness of their arguments. Clips of her exchanges began to circulate online, shared by those who recognized in her a reflection of themselves, sharp, unyielding, unwilling to shrink in spaces that wanted her small. Her advocacy wasn't just about spectacle. Behind the viral moments were hours of labor, drafting policies, pushing reforms, amplifying voices too often muted. Crockett fought for voting rights, for economic fairness, for accountability in systems designed to evade it. She spoke not as someone parachuting into the struggle, but as someone born from it, carrying the frustrations and hopes of communities long sidelined. What made her rise so unique was her refusal to compartmentalize her identity. She brought her full self into every room, her background, her culture, her truth. And that authenticity resonated. In a political landscape often dominated by rehearsed platitudes, Crockett's candor was revolutionary. She didn't soften her edges to appease power. She sharpened them to challenge it. The result was a growing coalition of supporters who saw in her not just a politician, but a symbol. For young women, especially women of color, Crockett embodied the possibility that brilliance need not wait for permission. For immigrants and working-class families, she represented a champion who understood their struggles not as statistics, but as lived reality. For progressives, she became proof that the fight for justice could still produce warriors unafraid of the battlefield. But every hero's journey comes with trials, and Crockett's was no exception. She endured smear campaigns, misrepresentations, and endless questions about her legitimacy. Each attack, however, only seemed to strengthen her resolve. The courtroom had taught her how to stand under pressure, and politics was simply another arena demanding that same tenacity. By the time she stood in that Senate chamber, facing rivals who had underestimated her and allies who silently cheered her on, Crockett had already lived through battles that dwarfed the petty arrogance of her detractors. She had already proven time and again that brilliance does not ask for permission to exist. And so, when the Senate lights bore down on her, Crockett was ready for the storm. The chamber was restless, the kind of restlessness that grows when arguments circle like vultures, waiting for a chance to strike. Questions were hurled toward Jasmine Crockett with the precision of darts, each one designed not to seek truth but to expose weakness. Her critics came armed with smirks, rehearsed talking points, and the quiet satisfaction of believing this was the moment she would falter. But Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned into the microphone, her expression calm, her voice steady. Every answer was delivered with clarity, every fact grounded in evidence. She was deliberate, not defensive, wielding her words like a shield and a sword all at once. Each time an opponent tried to corner her, she pivoted, turning their assumptions back on them with a wit that sliced sharper than any insult. "Representative Crockett, don't you think your approach is a little too emotional for this setting?" one senator asked, his tone dripping with condescension. The insinuation was obvious. That passion equaled irrationality, that her intensity was unbecoming of the chamber. Crockett smiled faintly, then replied, "If standing up for the people who sent me here is too emotional, then I'll wear that proudly. What I won't do is confuse apathy with professionalism." The words lingered in the air, leaving her opponent momentarily speechless. From the gallery, a ripple of approval could be felt, though unspoken. Reporters scribbled furiously. Her detractors shifted in their seats, annoyed at how effortlessly she had sidestepped the trap. And through it all, Warren's eyes never left her, studying her with an intensity that suggested she saw something others refused to acknowledge. The tension only grew. Another critic leaned forward, voice rising with false indignation, attempting to paint Crockett as inexperienced. "Do you even understand the consequences of what you're proposing?" he demanded, his words echoing with practiced outrage. Crockett's response was sharp, her tone clipped with precision. "I understand the consequences of doing nothing. I've seen them up close. They're not numbers on a spreadsheet. They're families torn apart, communities struggling, lives on the line. If you want to debate consequences, let's start there." The chamber shifted again. Each exchange was like a wave crashing harder than the one before. Crockett remained unshaken, her composure a quiet defiance against those who longed to see her unravel. And Warren, seated just a few rows away, listened with a look that blended admiration with recognition, as though she understood the battle unfolding wasn't just about policy. It was about legitimacy, about who gets to claim space in the nation's most hallowed halls. By now, even her opponents sensed the tension slipping away from them. What was meant to be a barrage had turned into a showcase. Instead of diminishing Crockett, their attacks only amplified her brilliance, each challenge giving her another chance to display her skill. Yet still, they pressed on, unwilling to concede, desperate for a misstep. The silence between questions grew heavier, as though everyone in the chamber could feel that something larger was building. The audience leaned forward. The critics gritted their teeth. And Crockett, steady as ever, prepared to meet whatever came next. And just as the room braced for yet another attack, Warren leaned forward. Elizabeth Warren was not known for handing out easy praise. In the Senate, her words carried weight precisely because they were rarely sentimental. She was sharp, disciplined, often surgical with her critiques, which is why, when she leaned forward, all eyes followed. The chamber, once loud with volleys of accusation and rebuttal, seemed to shrink into silence. It was the stillness before a storm, except this time, the storm was about to break in a way no one expected. Warren's voice cut through the air, calm but unyielding. "I've sat in this chamber for years," she began, her cadence slow and deliberate, as though she wanted every word to land with maximum impact. "And I can say without hesitation that what Representative Crockett has demonstrated here today is not only courage, it is brilliance. The words rang out like a gavel strike. At first, there was disbelief. Heads snapped up. Pens froze. A few gasps escaped from the gallery. Compliments of this kind were not part of the Senate's usual choreography, certainly not delivered with such clarity, and certainly not aimed at someone as new, as disruptive, as unapologetic as Jasmine Crockett. Crockett herself remained composed, but there was a flicker, just a flicker, of acknowledgement in her eyes. She knew the magnitude of what had just been said. This wasn't flattery, it was validation, and it came from one of the Senate's fiercest and most respected voices. Across the aisle, the reaction was stark. Detractors stiffened in their chairs, their lips pressed into thin lines. Some exchanged uneasy glances, as though silently asking, "Did she really just say that?" For months they had worked tirelessly to paint Crockett as reckless, unqualified, out of her depth, and in a single sentence, Warren had dismantled their narrative. But she didn't stop there. Warren leaned closer to her microphone, her voice gaining strength. Too often in this chamber, voices like Representative Crockett's are dismissed before they are heard. Too often, brilliance is ignored when it comes from someone who doesn't fit the mold of what power expects. Today, we've seen the opposite. We've seen clarity. We've seen courage. We've seen leadership that deserves recognition. The silence deepened, heavy and electric. The chamber had shifted. This was not the script anyone had prepared for. Crockett's critics had hoped for a stumble, a misstep they could exploit. Instead, Warren had reframed the entire moment, turning what was meant to be a gauntlet into a coronation. And in that reframing, the dynamics of the room cracked open. The so-called villains, the smirking senators, the pundits already drafting, dismissive headlines in their minds, suddenly found themselves on the defensive. Warren's words had not only lifted Crockett, they had exposed the smallness of those who sought to tear her down. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing this clip would run endlessly across networks and social feeds. Staffers whispered at the edges of the chamber, their eyes darting between Warren and Crockett, aware that they were witnessing something historic. It wasn't just the substance of Warren's praise, it was the audacity of it. To speak so plainly, to call brilliance what it was, in a place where acknowledgement is rationed like gold, was nothing short of revolutionary. Crockett's detractors tried to mask their discomfort. One senator leaned back with exaggerated disinterest, as though Warren's words didn't matter. Another shuffled papers, eyes fixed downward. But the tension in their posture betrayed them. They knew the game had changed. Their carefully crafted strategy to minimize, to belittle, to control the narrative had just unraveled. Warren, meanwhile, continued with a steadiness that only heightened the drama. "This institution," she declared, sweeping her gaze across the room, "was not built to celebrate diversity of thought. It was built to contain it. But moments like this remind us why the struggle is worth it. Because every so often, someone, like Representative Crockett, walks in and the walls shake." That line hung in the air, impossible to ignore. It was not just praise, it was prophecy. It suggested a shift, a turning of tides, a future where brilliance from voices long suppressed would not only be recognized, but embraced. And the weight of that possibility unsettled those who had spent their careers defending the old hierarchies. The chamber was still quiet, but it was not the silence of dismissal anymore. It was the silence of reckoning. Every person in that room understood that something irreversible had just happened. Warren had spoken a truth that could not be unsaid. Crockett, for her part, did not gloat. She did not bask. She did what heroes do in such moments. She held her composure, let the words land, and allowed the validation to speak for itself. That restraint, that dignity, only deepened the contrast between her and those who sought to diminish her. And then came the ripple. A murmur spread through the gallery, through staffers, through the press pool. Phones buzzed as texts and tweets began flying before Warren had even finished. Clips were already being cut, headlines forming, the story taking shape in real time. The praise wasn't just a moment, it was about to become a movement. For her critics, this was the nightmare scenario. For her supporters, it was vindication. And for the millions watching from afar, it was a reminder of why they tuned into politics at all. For the rare, electric moments when truth pierces through arrogance, when brilliance refuses to be silenced. In the chamber, the atmosphere was transformed. Where there had been tension, there was now awe. Where there had been dismissal, there was now recognition. Warren had not simply defended Crockett. She had elevated her, placed her squarely in the spotlight, and forced the nation to see what some had tried so hard to ignore. And as the murmurs grew into a swell of reaction beyond those walls, it became clear that the shockwave had only just begun. But the shockwaves didn't end in that room. They exploded across the nation. The moment Elizabeth Warren's words left her lips, the Senate chamber froze. But outside those walls, the ripple turned into a tidal wave. What had begun as an unexpected declaration of praise became the most replayed clip in politics within hours. Cable networks cut their programming to play it again and again, each anchor leaning forward with a mix of disbelief and excitement. Social media ignited like dry brush catching flame. Hashtags forming within minutes. Timelines overwhelmed by a single refrain. Warren said it. Crockett earned it. For Warren's supporters, it was vintage brilliance, a seasoned senator breaking protocol to tell the truth as she saw it. But for Crockett's base, and for countless Americans who had been watching her rise, it was more than that. It was validation. It was vindication. It was proof that the energy they had invested in her wasn't just hope, it was real power, recognized at the highest level. Commentators scrambled to keep up with the narrative shift. On progressive outlets, panels marveled at the audacity of the moment. This wasn't just a compliment, one analyst said, leaning toward the camera with wide eyes. This was Warren throwing a gauntlet down to the establishment, saying, "Pay attention, this woman is not just holding her own, she's leading." Meanwhile, conservative pundits sputtered with frustration. On primetime shows, they dismissed Warren's remarks as political theatre, even as the clip looped on their own screens. Some sneered that it was identity politics at work. Others warned ominously that this kind of rhetoric was dangerous because it might embolden younger leaders to challenge the old guard. Their very alarm underscored the point. Warren's praise had rattled the foundations. In communities far from DC, the effect was immediate and visceral. In barbershops and cafes, in classrooms and living rooms, people talked about Jasmine Crockett's name with fresh reverence. For immigrant families, for young women of color, for those who had long felt excluded from the inner sanctums of power, the message was electrifying. Not only could someone like them survive in those rooms, they could shine so brightly that the Senate itself had to stop and stare. The press amplified the drama. Headlines crackled with energy. Warren stuns Senate with praise for Crockett. Power shift in real time. Brilliance recognized. Silence broken. Newspapers that had once relegated Crockett to small columns now plastered her name across the front page. The story wasn't about a single moment anymore. It was about what that moment symbolized. And in the Senate itself, the aftershocks were impossible to ignore. Detractors who had dismissed Crockett the day before now measured their words more carefully, wary of sparring with someone whose brilliance had just been anointed on the record. Allies who had offered quiet support began to step forward more boldly, emboldened by Warren's declaration. What had been a lonely climb for Crockett was suddenly a movement with momentum. Crockett's composure only amplified the effect. She didn't flood the airwaves with self-congratulation. She didn't take a victory lap. Instead, she remained steady, focused on the work. That restraint only made the praise ring louder, because it wasn't spun into a spectacle by her. It was elevated into a rallying cry by the people who saw themselves reflected in her. By the end of the week, The political landscape looked different. Fundraising surges poured in. Organizing networks buzzed with renewed energy. Students printed Warren's words on posters. Activists quoted them at rallies. The moment had crossed the barrier between politics as usual and politics as inspiration. And yet, beneath the surge of celebration, there was unease. For every supporter energized by Warren's words, there were powerful forces unsettled by them. Old alliances were shaken. Quiet conversations, behind closed doors, hinted at new strategies to contain this rising star before her light burned too bright. Because brilliance, once recognized, is not easily ignored. And for those invested in the status quo, that was the most dangerous truth of all. The aftershocks weren't just shaking the chamber. They were reshaping the battlefield. And the reason this moment was so dangerous, it challenged the very power structure that has always tried to silence voices like Crockett's. When the storm of headlines faded into a low, steady hum, what remained was the truth at the core of that Senate chamber moment. Warren's praise wasn't just a spark of kindness or a fleeting headline. It was a mirror held up to America. It asked the question, who gets to be recognized as brilliant, as worthy, as essential to the nation's progress? And in answering that question with Jasmine Crockett's name, Warren had done more than honor a colleague. She had illuminated the quiet battle being fought in every institution across the country. Crockett, for her part, never once let the glow of that spotlight distract her from the work. She knew that every ounce of recognition carried with it a responsibility, one not to herself, but to those who had invested their hope in her. She had come from communities where brilliance often went unnoticed, where sacrifice was invisible, where hard work was dismissed, until someone with power finally gave it a name. And so, when Warren named her brilliance aloud, Crockett carried it not as a trophy, but as a charge. The lesson resounded far beyond the marble columns of Washington. That dignity is stronger than disdain. That truth pierces through arrogance, and that brilliance cannot be hidden forever. In Crockett's story, people saw a reminder that the structures built to exclude could be challenged, dismantled, even reimagined. Her resilience was no longer just her own. It was a collective inheritance, proof that voices long silenced could not only be heard but celebrated. For Warren, the moment was a reaffirmation of her own belief that progress requires courage, that even within rigid systems, one must sometimes break the silence to create space for something new. Her words were not only for Crockett, but for every young leader watching, wondering if they, too, could stand their ground and be recognized. The moral was clear. Greatness is not confined to pedigree or privilege. It is born of struggle, sharpened by resistance, and revealed in moments of truth. As the chamber slowly returned to routine, the echo of that thunderclap moment refused to fade. Students repeated it in classrooms. Parents told their children about it at dinner tables. Activists carried it on banners at rallies. It became more than Senate drama. It became a story of what America could look like if brilliance was not denied by bias, but elevated by courage. And so, in the end, the moral stretched beyond politics. It was about humanity, about the recognition that brilliance knows no single color, no single gender, no single origin. It rises wherever people stand with integrity and fight for dignity. Crockett embodied that truth, and Warren's acknowledgement gave it voice. The chamber had been stunned into silence, but the people carried the sound forward, an anthem of validation, resilience, and hope. And for those who wondered what came next, there was only one certainty. Jasmine Crockett was no longer just surviving the storm. She was redefining it. And so, from a single sentence spoken in the Senate chamber, a chain reaction began. One that no headline, no dismissive pundit, no rival could undo. Elizabeth Warren's acknowledgement of Jasmine Crockett's brilliance was more than political commentary. It was a signal. It was a declaration that the tide is shifting, that voices once underestimated are not only here to stay, but are rising to lead. For the millions who watched, replayed, and shared that moment, the message was deeply personal. It was about identity, about resilience, about the fight to be seen. Crockett's journey stood as proof that brilliance forged in struggle can shine even in the most hostile arenas, and when it does, it cannot be ignored. But here's the real question. What do we, the audience, do with that inspiration? Because this story isn't only about Jasmine Crockett. It's about all of us. It's about carrying her example into our own communities, our own battles, our own moments when silence demands to be broken. So if this story moved you, if it made you proud, if it reminded you of the power of dignity over arrogance, then don't let it end here. Share it. Talk about it. Keep the ripple alive. And if you want to be part of a community that lifts up these stories of courage, resilience, and brilliance, make sure you subscribe, hit that notification bell, and add your voice to this growing movement. Because brilliance recognized is not brilliance contained. It spreads, it inspires, and it transforms. This isn't just political drama. It's a vision of what America can be when truth speaks louder than power. And together, we can make sure it never goes unheard.